Miracles on Maple Hill, Chapter 7. Foxes. It was the very last Friday before the very last week of school. As they drove up the hill, Mother always called the Great Slippery because of that first time they were stuck on it. Joe suddenly said something wonderful to Marley. "You know, there's the queerest place up this side of the sugar bush. Moss all over on great big bumps. I'll show it to you tomorrow if you want." She held her breath. Had he explored and explored until now he had started to want to show somebody? "We call those bump things hummocks," Mother said. "Some are ant hounds," Joe said, "the little ones." He smiled at Marley. "I'll show you tomorrow." She could tell he had something very special on his mind. "Shall I fix the lunch?" she asked. He liked it when she fixed a lunch, if that didn't slow them up too much getting started. "I can get up real early and fix it." "That'll be swell," he said. So at last she thought the time had come. Now she could go anywhere and be as safe as could be, even if there were cows. With Joe, she wouldn't need to be one bit afraid. She was awake so early the next morning that the birds had hardly beat her to it. As she hurried with the sandwiches and cookies and fruit, she kept humming inside, like a cat. Now, I'm wondering if she's humming because she's sad to have gotten up early, or if she's really humming because she's excited about this day's events. I think it might be the latter. Joe was surprised to find her all ready when he came down, and how pleased. There she was, waiting on the back step with two neat sacks beside her, one for herself and one for him, only his exactly twice as big. Joe explained some things on the way up the road. Maple Mountain was strange, Mr. Chris said, because it had swamps and bogs up in its highest places. I'm guessing that means that most mountains don't have swamps and bogs in their high places. The humpy bumpy meadows on top were part of its queerness too. Joe and Marley went from one hump to the other, opened some to watch ants, and looked at the queer moss and starry little plants on others. Joe had his magnifying glass, and they gazed into the strangest worlds, with funny little bugs tumbling around in the moss like animals in a jungle. They went on to a little valley then, and followed a brook that made one huge curve after another, doubling itself over like a coiled rope. Now, coiled is when things are circular on top of each other, almost like a spring. It's a coil. We're going to go back to reading now. Joe said the curves were meanders, and he showed her rocks in that stream bed that were full of ancient shells. They'd been left there ages ago when the ocean was practically everywhere. There were scrapings on the big stones and perfectly round stones that Joe said were shaped by huge slides of ice that were in that very spot about 1,000,000 years ago. Or maybe 1,000,000,000. Marley couldn't think what the difference might be with those numbers, only that one was lots bigger than the other. She felt proud of all Joe knew. Maybe Mr. Chris knew about flowers and birds and things, but Joe was the one who knew about bugs, the queer plants that grew on stumps and fallen trees. They had nice names, too. For instance, there were funny things like little plugged up funnels, some gray called pixie cups, and some bright red called British soldiers. Now, I remember in my American history, when the British invaded the colonies, they were called the Redcoats. So maybe that's why things that are bright, those plants and things that are bright red, were called British soldiers. Let's keep reading. And there were odd little shelves that looked like they'd been made for fairies to sit on. only Joe said they were just wood rot. On old logs there were tall black things called dead man's fingers. And one funny toadstool was bright yellow, called a jack-o'-lantern, that Joe said really gave light at night. So that must mean it glows in the dark. And that comes from luminescence, I think. Joe said, "Joe, you know more things than Mr. Chris," Marley said. To her surprise, he said, "Oh, no, I don't. Nobody knows more than Chris. Who do you think told me most of that stuff? We came out here last week and Chris showed me some things I wanted to show you. In the fall around here, there are mushrooms all over, if you know where to find them. One of Mr. Chris's hired men, before Fritz, used to gather quarts and quarts and sell them to an Italian in town and make a mint of money every fall." So let's think about what that word mint, or what that phrase mint of money means. Now, I know that I can buy mint gum, so that could be a flavoring. But in context, I'm wondering exactly what this word mint means. Seems to me the U.S. government has a place called the Mint, and that's where they print money. So, I'm wondering if he means, and they would have a lot of money there, I'm wondering if he means that you could make a lot of money when he says make a mint of money. What do y'all think? Let's keep reading. She hardly heard the last of it. "Joe," she said, "Mr. Chris didn't climb clear up this hill, did he? Why, if Chrissy heard about that—" Joe went red. He pretended not to hear what she was saying, but leaned over and then knelt right down on the ground. "Look there at that striped beetle, blister beetle, that's who. When we get to a pool I found, I'll show you some diving beetles too. You ever see a whirly-jig?" "Joe, did he?" she asked. "Because he shouldn't. Chrissy told me to look out for him and not let him climb even the littlest hill. And this one—" She looked behind them at the steep path. "You know, the other day I saw a huge bumblebee caught in a lady slipper," Joe said. "Couldn't get out to save him. I could hear him a block off a-roaring." Marley interrupted. It wasn't because she was interested in the bumblebee, but Joe had to know about taking care of Mr. Chris if he didn't know it already. "Joe, you and Chris were supposed to go into town that day in the car." He stood up suddenly and turned to her. "I guess you'll go right and tell," he said. "Just like a girl, can't keep anything to herself." "Sure, we went to town. We talked with that man in the restaurant. See? He buys all his syrup from Mr. Chris and says it's the best syrup in the world. He buys all his apple juice from Mr. Chris too, and he says he used to buy chestnuts. But that's been years and years. After Mr. Chris and I came up here, and he showed me these old chestnut snags. See, along there? There used to be so many you could get a half a bushel of chestnuts in an hour." "Joe, Mr. Chris didn't walk clear up here, did he?" Marley asked. "You shouldn't ever let him. Chrissy said. She told me we've got to help because when he gets interested in in showing people things, he just forgets." Okay. We walked real slow and he told me how this country used to look. Lots more forest than now. Between diseases like the one that killed all the chestnuts and then people timbering their land, he says almost all the virgin forest is gone now. Marley stood still as if what Joe had said had started. I'm going to back up. Marley stood still as if what Joe said had started the sound. She suddenly began to hear the whine of a saw. From Mr. Chris's place? "Joe, Mr. Chris isn't cutting down trees, is he, just for money? He told me he never would." "Of course he's not. He looked disgusted that she had even asked. "But I want to watch them cutting that tree. It's an old maple," he said. As they walked, the whining of the saw grew louder and louder until it seemed to make huge circles of sound through the woods. They made a big circle and came finally to the sugar bush. Mr. Chris was there with Fritz and a strange man with an electric saw. The old tree at which the saw was working was dead, except one great branch that stood green among the masses of brown boughs. It was over a yard thick and was giving the saw a very hard time of it. Mr. Chris waved to Marley and Joe as they came. When he talked, he had to shout over the ugly whining of the saw. "A grand old tree," he said, "a grand sugar tree for years and years. I've tapped it every season until this last one for at least 30 years. We used to boil the sap right over there. Had a long oven and one big pan. You can even see the old stones where the oven was." Joe and Marley stood watching. They didn't try to talk, and Mr. Chris didn't say any more either for a while. The saw's humming was almost a scream as it got near the center of the trunk. Mr. Chris leaned close to Marley's ear. "When she falls, we'll count the rings and see just how old she is," he said. Now, I don't know if y'all know this or not, but that is how you tell how old a tree is. When you cut it down, you look at the cut part, and you'll see concentric circles. It'll start in the center, and it'll work its way out. Because trees grow from the middle outwards, those outer circles will represent each year of the tree's first life. And then the next one in would be its second year, and the next one in would be its third, and so forth, all the way into the middle. That middle circle, that teeny tiny little circle, would be where it starts its growth for this specific year. Okay, we're going to keep going. A red squirrel began scolding from another tree. Mr. Chris looked up and shook his fist, laughing. "It's all right, old fella," he called. "We're leaving you your butternut tree. But this old maple is going to come home with us and keep us warm this winter." The squirrel sat looking at him, its paws folded in front as if it might be saying its prayers. Then the great maple began to crack and groan, and the squirrel turned and vanished into a hole. Fritz shouted, "Watch out! She's coming down!" Like a giant, the great tree fell. Its immense dead limbs struck the ground first and broke, crashing, and it sagged and roared and seemed to fight with the air. For a minute it lay trembling all over. Then it was still. Marley wanted to cry, but Joe laughed and yelled, "Hurrah! Boy, oh boy!" And before the tree had really settled down, he was into the branches, and then he was counting the rings. That tree had been growing for over 100 years. It was dusk as they started for home. Now that the saw had ceased to whine, the silence seemed immense and wonderful. They could hear the rustling of the trees that still stood up straight into the air. Suddenly, just as they came to the hummocky place, Joe clutched Marley's arms, and then, without warning, he laid his hand across her mouth, whispering, "Shh." It was lucky he saw it first, or she might have yelled the way she did when she saw the deer. Joe whispered, "Look." Up on one of those bumpy hummocks, just standing with its huge bushy tail straight out behind, was a red fox. It stood looking down the hill, one paw lifted like a puppy paying attention to everything. Then it leaped suddenly to another hummock and stood there looking. The sun was down and a weird light was all over everything, so the fox seemed to have a shine all over. Marley and Joe didn't move. Neither did the fox. Finally then, without a sound, looking like a colored shadow, the fox slipped from the hummock and was gone. It disappeared into the ravine by the brook. Now, a ravine is an extremely deep gully in the earth. And you know what a gully is from our first couple of chapters. Ravines tend to have very steep sides, and they're very, very deep. I'll bet she's got a den around here, Joe said. His voice was low, and when he walked easy, in a certain way he knew, the way he had learned Indians walked. Marley couldn't hear him past 10 yards. She wanted to call, "Don't go out of sight, Joe," because dark was starting and there was that strange light, rather eerie, as night fell over Maple Mountain. But she didn't call. She didn't make a sound. In a minute, she was glad she hadn't. Joe came slipping back out of the shadows, beckoning. Beckoning means calling. "Shh, and don't fall over anything," he said. "Joe, what is it?" "Shh." At one place, the hill went suddenly down, rocky and steep. At the top, Joe took hold of her arm, and then he pointed with his other hand. In the dusk were 5 little foxes playing together. They tumbled about like puppies. They chased each other. They made little growly sounds, pretending to fight. They were all red except for their black pointed noses and their sharp black ears. And each one had a white tip on its long red tail. Joe and Marley watched until they couldn't see a thing but the white tips of the tails. Then these too vanished. Joe led Marley toward home over the hummocks, holding her by the hand. She had never loved him so much in all her life. "Joe, if it hadn't been for you, I'd never have seen anything like that. Not ever," she said. "Why not? I see things all the time," he said. But she could tell he was pleased that she had said it. The Chris's and Fritz were at the house when they got back, and soon as Marley got into the door and saw them, she cried, "Guess what we saw, Joe and me, up by the high pasture? Some fox!" And then she said suddenly, "Ouch!" because Joe had given her a big pinch. He hadn't done it soon enough. She already had the word out of her mouth. Fritz leaned forward in his chair. "Foxes, huh? So that's where they are." He turned to Mr. Chris. "I knew they were around close somewhere, didn't I, Chris? I can go in the morning. Maybe if I go before light, I can grab the whole bunch." Grab them? Marley felt her eyes go wide. "Fritz, you don't mean you want to catch those little foxes, do you?" she said. "Why, this one has 5 babies, the cutest little puppies." She saw Joe's look. Oh, she never knew when to keep her mouth shut. That's what his look said to her, as plain as day. "5 little ones, huh? No wonder she's been busy," Mr. Chris said. "How many chickens does that take every day?" "Every day for a solid week. That she-devil has been at my chickens. We put the flock in the coop last night, and she got in under the wall. Or her mate, it was. If they aren't the cleverest. And that dog, Tony, doesn't even notice anymore," Chrissy said. "I tell Chris he's too old for a watchdog now. He sleeps like a stone." Marley's mouth felt dry. "What are you going to do?" she asked. She didn't dare even look at Joe. A little silence fell. Everybody suddenly remembered Marley and those mice. "Well," Mr. Chris said, and gave a queer little cough. "To tell you the truth, Marley, this country is overrun with foxes the past few years." He turned back to Fritz and Daddy as if he'd rather not talk to her about it anymore. There's a good big bounty on them now, and if you want to fix the pelts up, you can get more. Now, bounty is an amount of money that is paid to you for bringing in a specific thing. In this case, it would be dead. But bounty does not always mean dead. Sometimes it means dead or alive. And a pelt is the fox's outer layer of skin. They tan it like the Indians used to do deer hide and bear hide and beaver hide. It can be used decoratively. It can be used. A lot of women use foxes to make coats and stoles or scarves that go around your neck, that kind of thing. Especially in this time, fur was a very prominent fashion statement. So let's keep reading. Then he looked straight at Joe. You show Fritz the place in the morning, Joe. Maybe you can get a shot or so yourself. Was this Mr. Chris? Marley gazed at him. Tell you what, we'll split the bounty, Joe, no matter who gets him, Fritz said. He was a good shot. Marley knew. She had heard them tell about how many rabbits and pheasants and squirrels Fritz got in hunting season. Okay, Joe said. Marley turned to him in unbelief after seeing those little foxes playing as the sun went down. Joe, you wouldn't, she said. Those things eat mice too, Mr. Chris said hastily. Marley, they eat hundreds and hundreds of mice. If I just had livestock and grain, or even orchards, I'd say the more foxes the better. But chickens? Marley couldn't manage another word or stand to hear one. Everybody was agreeing, and she knew there wasn't any use. If even Joe, after what he had seen. Suddenly, the words of the song Daddy sang sometimes came back to her. Not the song about the fox coming for the big black duck, heavens no, but the one about the cruel hunters in their red coats, and the nice boy who felt sorry for the fox and refused to tell them which way it had gone. Had Joe forgotten? When the Chris's and Fritz went away, Fritz called back to Joe that he'd be calling by real early, maybe about 5 o'clock. Joe went right up to bed then without a word, and Marley felt herself go cold all over. She reached for Daddy's arm as he started for the stairs. Daddy, about the foxes. Marley, please, Mother said. There's no earthly use of you worrying about things like that. You've got to learn. I was only going to ask Daddy to sing tonight, Marley said. Those foxes made me think about the fox songs. Daddy and Mother looked at each other. First, the one about the fox stealing the goose, Marley said to get them off track of what she meant to do. Then she thought if Daddy would sing the one about the hunters and the wonderful kind boy who wouldn't tell them where the fox went, Joe would understand what she was going to say when she went upstairs. He couldn't help but understand after that song. Well, all right, just those two, Daddy said. You know, Lee, getting so I can do the hunting song pretty well again. And he really could. The first verse about the hunters coming and the horns blowing and the scarlet coats went really fast. Marley opened the door to the stairs so Joe would be sure to hear. Say there, youngster, the huntsman cry. Say, have you seen the fox go by? Galloping, 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 galloping over the hill. Now, Marley thought, and opened the door a little wider. This was the verse for Joe to hear. But would I be telling them? No, not I, that I saw the fox go wearily by, wearily panting, worn and spent. Would I be telling them the way he went, galloping, galloping, galloping? Daddy was wonderful. The way he made the words sound slow and tired, as if the poor fox was ready to drop. Then, suddenly, he shouted the last two words, "No, not I." It made Marley's hair wiggle every time she heard it. It was so wonderful. But especially tonight. She kissed Daddy goodnight more fervently than ever before and went upstairs, closing the door after her. But Joe's door was closed and his light was out. So he didn't want to talk about it. But she did. She had to. She opened his door just a crack and whispered, "Joe?" No sound. "Joe," she said. Suddenly he spoke. He wasn't in bed at all. He was sitting in the dark by the window. "Just shut up for a while," he said in a low voice. "Can you? Got to figure out what we can do. If I went over there and threw rocks and tramped all over there where the den is, see if I could just scare them out of there before Fritz can get there." "Oh, Joe, of course you can," she said. And then excitedly, "Tonight? Joe, way over to the hill tonight?" His voice sounded disgusted. "I can't very well wait until morning this time, can I? If Fritz ever heard of me doing a thing like that, he'd think I was crazy. Why, there's 7 of them right there, $4 bounty apiece. That's a lot of money." She felt his eyes through the dark. "If you just didn't have to tell everything you know. Sometimes I think it's better to never tell you anything or show you anything." "Joe, I'm sorry. Honest. I'll never tell anything again. Why, I just thought Mr. Chris and Chrissy and Fritz would love those little foxes." She looked beyond Joe out the window. It was deep, dark, and scary, and she shivered. "Joe, it'll be horrible to go clear over there past all those bumpy places and everything in the dark. If I took a light and then just shot at the ground near the den," he said, thinking aloud, his voice very low, "I guess you could go along and hold the light, couldn't you? Just so we get 'em out of there." "Joe, you mean I can go?" She felt a glow everywhere, a happiness that was like suddenly running out of the cold into a warm, bright house. She had put the foxes in danger, but now she could go out into the night and help make them safe again. The trouble is, maybe they'll fight. I don't know. Look what it says in my field book. She closed the door, and he turned his light on and showed her the place. "Look. Male feeds female and young and leads enemy away from den at risk of his life." "But we're not enemies," she said. "It's Fritz he should lead away." "Too bad Father Fox doesn't know that now, isn't it?" Joe asked. "You say the silliest things I ever heard, but it's not a question of leading Fritz away. He knows where the den is now." "Only I hadn't mentioned it," she cried. "Well, that's spilled milk now. Figurative language. What kind of figurative language is that, and what does that term spilled milk mean?" We're going to read on. "You didn't know." He sat staring at the book as if it might give him an idea. "Maybe if we build a little fire by one door, we could smoke 'em out. Like bees," he said. "They always have a front door and a back door." She was enchanted. "Joe, how clever! A front door and a back door. Now, just act like you're going to bed," he told her. "But put on some warm socks and things. We'll go as soon as Dad and Mother are asleep." What ages it seemed before Daddy and Mother came upstairs, before they were finally finished in the bathroom and had climbed into bed, before Daddy finally began to snore. Marley heard Joe's door open. She was so excited she could hardly breathe, and a funny little pain started at the back of her neck. Moving as silently as possible, she followed Joe's shadow down the stairs. He was getting the flashlights out of the drawer. Then he got a pocket full of matches and a rag and a can of kerosene. Now, many of you may have a kerosene heater that you use in the wintertime. But kerosene is a fuel. It's similar to gasoline, but it has a very different smell. It lights easy, and a long time ago, it was used to light. Kerosene lamps were used to light places that didn't have electricity. Today, kerosene is used primarily as a heating fuel. It's also used as a jet fuel. Okay, back to reading. Goodness, but that road was dark. Joe led the way, only flashing a light once in a while and then very briefly. They passed Chris's house, all dark, and went on to the field and the pasture. How wide and high the night was! Marley had never seen it look so huge. She looked up with the biggest, highest feeling she'd ever had all her life as they started up the hill. If it hadn't been for Joe walking close ahead, she knew she'd have been scared enough to die. In her tracks. Shadows hung over the road and slipped around the trees and stones when Joe flashed the light. At the top of the slope where the den was, Joe stood still and waited for a long time. Was he afraid? Marley was scared to think he might be, because if Joe was scared, well, I mean, it was really dangerous. But he wasn't scared. He was only planning what to do. After a while, he spoke quite loud, and she jumped. She had expected he would whisper, "Look, Marley, you shine both the flashlights into the hole, see? When I find it, I'll fix this rag, then we'll light it and stuff it in and run, see?" "Where will we run?" "Back up here. Then we can watch and see what they do." That was exactly what they did. Joe made a big noise going down the slope. He let rocks roll under him and everything. The sooner the foxes were scared now, the better, of course. They had come to scare foxes. "Here's the den," he said. It was a real big hole with grass over the top, like a huge eyebrow, so nobody would ever have seen it from above. Marley's hand shook so her lights went wobble, wobble. The rag flared at once the minute Joe struck the first match, and Joe tossed it in. And then they ran, stumbling and slipping as they climbed. They didn't have long to wait. Out of the other door came a long, slim shape, and another smaller, and then a whole quick row of them. The flame showed them as plain, and besides, Joe suddenly turned a flashlight full onto them. There was a flashing of eyes, and that was all. The rag died down and went out, and there wasn't a sound. They waited. Far off, a dog barked. Or was it a dog? "I'm not sure the father was even here," Joe said. "I only saw one big one. Maybe he'd gone off to hunt and she's calling him." Once more they heard the barking. It sounded far off. "If that's her barking, she's gone a long way already," Joe said. "I don't think they'll come back here. But in case they do, we'd better put some rocks and things in the doors. You too tired?" "No, I'm not tired at all." It was true. She was too excited to be tired. She walked right beside them, and they put lots of rocks in both the doors. "Well, I guess that's all we can do," Joe said. Now that it was over, Marley was so tired She could hardly walk, but she didn't say so. When they got home, they didn't make a sound, except right at her door, Joe suddenly took her arm and squeezed it hard and whispered, "Now, keep your mouth shut about this, see? Not a word. Not a word," she said. "Honest, honest, Joe. Cross my heart." That was the last she knew until she heard Fritz give a little honk at dawn. He went everywhere in the truck because he had so much to do from one end of the farm to the other. Joe went down the stairs and Marley watched from the window. Joe had his gun. She lay shivering so hard she thought she'd be better up. So she went downstairs and built a fire that really burned. She even mixed biscuits. "Well, look who's up already," Daddy said. He went outside to listen and came back and asked, "You heard any shots yet, Marley?" "No," she said, "and I know you were listening." He patted her hand. He thought he understood, she thought, but this time he was all wrong. He didn't know half, and she would never tell either, in this world or another. They didn't ever hear any shooting, not that morning. Soon they heard the truck instead. Joe got out at the gate and waved his gun to say goodbye as Fritz drove away. Marley's heart was beating fast when Joe appeared at the door. She gave him one look and he winked. "Funniest thing," he said. "We went right to that place and there wasn't a sign of a fox. Den's all full of stuff. Fritz said he'd never saw anything like it before." Marley ran to look at the biscuits. They were done, huge and brown. She felt as if she would burst clear out of her skin with joy. So she began to sing, "Galloping, galloping, galloping." Her voice cracked when she sang, "Nope, not I," because it was on a note too high for her, but she didn't care. "I wonder," Daddy said. But he didn't say what he wondered, and nobody answered.